Hi, I'm Mark Rutten. Welcome back to Nomad Boatbuilding. Well, in the last video, we started making parts to build frames for this dory. Today, we're going to start assembling those. Now, this is going to be a slightly longer video because there's a fair bit of detail. So stick with me and let's go get to work. Alright, I'm all set up to do my glue up here. I've got the mylar pattern that I took off of my lofting. I've set up some blocks here. So these two blocks are just set up along my baseline. This baseline is going to represent the top of my strong back. The strong back is just a framework we build on top of that creates a level surface. I've added a couple blocks that support the outside of the frame that I'm about to assemble, both down near the bottom and out near the top. The last bit of blocking here is just a cleat to support where the bottom of the framing goes. So these are just allowing me to build my framework in place on this pattern and then be able to remove the parts as I need to assemble. So I start by putting my lower cleat down on here. Of course, you need to be conscious about which side of the frame that you're trying to build because I have bevels to consider. I've put a little mark here where my center line goes. I'm just going to use a clamp to clamp that in place. We've already planed and chamfered the corners on the insides of these so that we don't have to do that later on. The only surface that's still rough is a saw kerf on the back side, but that's okay to leave that there. I'm just using some lead weights to hold this down so it doesn't run around on me. The job that I need to do is to build little corner blocks in here. I'm going to be putting my gussets on here, and I want to fill the little void that's between the two gussets. Okay, now I've got a little scrap here, an offcut from one of these frame members. I want to split the difference between these two angles and lay this guy across. I need to know what this angle is here so that I can make a cut on the back side of one of these guys. So I'm just doing this by eye. Right there. There we go. Extend that line. I should be using a longer square. This square is not quite long enough. So I'm just going to take this over the bandsaw. I'm just going to make a 90-degree cut. I do have a slight angle on here, a 2-degree angle, but I'm just going to plane that in by hand. So I have two of these to make, one for either side, so I'm just going to mark the other side as well at the same time. I'm making the assumption that both these angles are exactly the same as they should be. Once I've got one angle fixed, that looks pretty good. It's a good tight fit. Now I can take the angle off of here. So I'm grabbing that angle, and I'm basically working right off of this face here. Now the other bit of information I need to know is what this angle is. So I'm going to take it off of the top here like so. So that's going to match this angle here. That's the angle I need to cut this at. There we go. Looks like I got a tiny bit of tweaking to do to get this to fit just right. So I'll just play around with that for a few more minutes until I'm satisfied. Now, really small pieces like this can be hard to trim with a block plane, so I'm just going to use one of my sanding sticks here. That's just about there. I think I'm satisfied with that. Now I don't have to get it perfect. I'm going to be using thickened epoxy, so if there's any small voids, they're going to fill. My goal is to just give me something that isn't going to be rocking around. Next I'm going to be dry fitting my knees. Now what I need to do actually is I need to trim a little bit off these. I gave these a little extra to allow for the bevel that's going to be on the other side, but on this side I don't need it. So I'm just going to get rid of just about 1/8 of an inch of both of these. Next I'm going to lay my knee up on top of there, and I'm just going to make it flush with the bottom of the bottom cleat here, and I'm also going to make it flush with the outside edge of this frame. Just going to sketch that on there. Just going to very carefully clamp that in place. Okay, and if everything looks good, I'm just going to drill for some 3/4 number 6 screws. So there's my first 2 holes. And that's utilizing those 2 pilot holes I had when I was building these. And now I'm going to lay out a second hole, and I've just got this little piece of door skin I'm using as a spacer. And I basically want to aim for the center of my knee. Right about there. I'll drill my second hole. Okay, now there's one last thing I want to do, and that is trim away the excess on my little filler block here. So I've drawn the shape of the knee in there. I'm just going to pull it out. And I'm just going to trim a little outside of that line. And I'm not going to worry about bevels. I'm just going to make it a square cut. Trying to bevel this be difficult because it's a winding bevel from 2 degrees to roughly 13 degrees on here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to cut it square. I'll shape it after it's all assembled. Okay, so I've left that proud by about 1/16 of an inch. It's just going to slip right down to there, and that's just perfect. And just blow all the sawdust away. Got a little block there. Just going to knock a little bit of hair off the edge, and we're ready to go. Alright, I just want to take a moment to thank you for watching so far. Now, if you like watching these videos, if you'd like to see me make more, you can help me do that by joining me over on Patreon. There's a link down there in the description. And if you can't join me there, that's fine, I understand. But you can still subscribe and hit that notification bell so you know when the next video's out. Now let's go get back to work. I'm using West System epoxy, and I've already mixed the hardener and resin together. And now I'm just adding thickeners. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this to what they refer to as sort of a jam consistency, just a little bit wetter than that. Right now, you would classify this as thin mayonnaise. I'm using their 205 filleting blend thickener. Let's add a little bit more. So far I've got in here what would amount to about a heaping tablespoon, and this is a single pump from their B-Pack pumps. That's sort of their 1 gallon kit. So there we go. That's just about right. I don't want it too thick, because what I'm not doing is I'm not wetting out these surfaces ahead of time, which is always a good policy. However, because I've got sort of a little bit of a complicated glue up here, and there's mechanical fasteners also helping to hold this together, I don't feel I need to worry about the pre-wetting of the surfaces. That's one of the reasons I'm using a slightly wetter consistency mix, is because I'm not doing that wet out. I need to make sure that this is going to penetrate effectively. So I'm being very generous with how I butter up my parts. There's going to be a lot of squeeze out, and that's fine. I'll be cleaning that up. Just giving them all a good wiggle together. And now I've just got to deal with the back of my gusset here. And I am going to butter up the gusset itself. And I'm doing the gusset as opposed to the frames partially because the surface of this gusset is a little more porous. So I want to make sure that it's thoroughly covered and it has a few moments to soak up that extra resin. And I'm just going to lay this down on my framework here, and I'm just going to wiggle it around just a tiny little bit just to make sure I got full coverage between both surfaces. You do need to be very careful that you're actually hitting your screw holes while you're doing this. And of course we don't want to strip our screws, so we're being a bit gentle about that too. And now I'm just going to clean up all the squeeze out with a putty knife and use it on my other side. Now, after I get both these sides glued up, I'm going to flip the whole framework over and add gussets to the other side. And there's one last thing I want to do. This little filler piece is so small and it's going to keep jumping out on me. I'm just using a small 23 gauge pin, a couple of pins, just to make sure it stays put. Now those pins aren't stainless, unfortunately, but that's okay. They're so buried in epoxy, they won't be a problem. And in general, I much prefer to use bronze fastenings throughout, but this boat, we're trying to get this boat done on a little bit of a budget, and so that's one of the areas where you can save money. I do think bronze is a better fastener and longer lasting than stainless steel. Okay, now on to the other side. Okay, now the last thing I need to do before I can turn this over, I have two things I need to do actually. I need to put on this, what we call this a cross ball. So I'm just going to fasten that on, and then I need to put center lines on both the cross ball and the bottom cleat. I'm just going to mark off the center line, and I'll do the same thing on the cleat. The last thing I need to do is to mark off where my shear line will land. That's going to be really important for lining off the hull later on. Now, these marks are kind of just approximate. We always tweak the shear line once we've got the boat underway. Now before I flip it, I just want to do a little bit of cleanup with the cloth soaked with alcohol here. Okay, now I don't need this. Take that away. I also don't need these now. Now while I have this off, I'm just going to quickly clean up all this glue that's squeezed out of my joints. I firmly believe working neatly is important when you're working with epoxy. I'm using a little alcohol on this cloth to clean up all this epoxy squeeze out. And I put a sacrificial piece of mylar over top of my drawing because this alcohol would clean off all my marks on there if I didn't do that. back on here. That looks good. Okay. And this is where these little slots come in handy. The slots are to, if I slide this out until my slot aligns with that edge, that gives me enough material poking out here to allow for beveling it off later on. So when I'm happy with that, I'm going to clamp that in place. Okay, there we go. Now time is a ticking. My epoxy has about a 20-minute pot life, and we've definitely been farting around for at least 15 minutes. Okay, there we go. Now all I gotta do is clean up all the squeeze out here. Now sometimes there's a temptation to try and do everything epoxy related right at this moment, like filling all these screw holes and such. But I've found you're better off just saving all of that for a second operation with sometimes even with a different consistency of filler. So for now, all I'm going to worry about is just cleaning off the extra. And I can come back to fill all of those at a later date. And that way you can do them all at once on all the frames and you'll have a consistent color. Sometimes your color can change up from one batch to the next if you've mixed it differently. And that one's done. So my next job is to just trim these guys down a little bit. So I'm going to take a bevel off of here. That's going to be the angle we need to cut at. I'm going to run a straight edge along my frame edge here and give myself a cut line. And I'm going to cut just a little proud of that line. Plating this end grain can always be tough, and this particular bit of fur is quite hard. The only thing you can do is use a very sharp plane and take light strokes. If you don't have a plane, you can do this with a belt sander, and that would work just fine. But I find belt sanders can be a little aggressive, and sometimes you can roll over this corner very easily with one. There we go. I'm going to clean up the bottom edge while I'm at it. Now I can move on to the next one. I'm just going to go at this with a little spoke shave. I think that's going to be the fastest way to get these cleaned up. I'm going to switch to a curved longboard to finish this up here. And that's just about there. Now I got a couple very small spots I could use just a dab of epoxy in this little joint here and there. I'm just going to stop there, clean this up, and I'll come back and finish that up after I've done a little bit of filling. And that's the danger of cleaning up too much squeeze out when you do your glue up. Okay, now it's time to fill all these little screw holes. So I've got this tape here that I've drilled holes through. Now these holes are a little bigger than 3/8 of an inch. And the idea is if you just smear epoxy over top of the surface of the wood, you tend to get big blotchy spots that will transmit even through paint, especially with this loose-grained wood. So the tape really just helps to contain the epoxy to where you need it to be. It's pretty quick and easy to do, and it's probably faster than trying to clean up any extra epoxy. The other thing it does is it leaves just the tiniest little bit of extra thickness here so that once it's done, when you go to sand, the epoxy will stand just a hair proud of your wood when you go to clean it all up, and then you'll get a nice flush finish. If I didn't do that, the epoxy would tend to sink down into that hole just a little bit, and the chances of getting a smooth finish on your first shot are much reduced. That little extra thickness of tape really helps. For doing this, we want our epoxy mixed that it's stiff enough that it'll stand up on its own, but without being too thick. You don't want it peanut butter thick, as they say, because usually it's a little bit too porous that way. We want it still to have a fine texture. So just taking a small amount on my putty knife, the trick here is to sweep a bunch over it and push down hard enough that a little bit pops out on one side of your hole. And that just ensures that you don't have any air bubbles trapped underneath. So the last thing I want to do is go and glue my tape down to my work here. Now there's a bunch of stuff that's sticking proud, and that's just fine. That'll sand away very quickly when I'm done. Alright, what didn't make it onto camera was a bunch of little tasks like sanding and filling little voids and things like that. These are tedious tasks, but if you don't go through them, you won't be happy with the end result. Good work simply takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. My next job is to put limber holes in the bottoms of the frames here. Now limber holes allow water to move from one frame bay area to the next. Basically allows for drainage. Some might call it scuppers. Scuppers actually let water from the deck off the boat. Limbers allow water to move within the boat. So I'm going to offset my limbers 3/8 of an inch in from the corners of my frames here. And I've made up this little router jig that allows me to cut them using a bullnose bit. So this jig is also set up to allow for the angles that I have here. I simply have to release this screw here, and then this can rotate around another screw. And then I just line up the slot in the jig with my layout line. Now it doesn't adjust for bevels this way, so I'm not worrying about that. The bevels in this boat are very slight, so I'm just going to ignore them. Once I got it lined up and the angle correct, drop a screw in to lock it up and clamp it in place. With a bullnose router bit and a depth stop on there, I can make the whole limber in just a few passes. Just a little cleanup with some sandpaper and it's done. Now you want to make sure you wet these out with epoxy quite well, because this is your only chance at putting any sort of finish in here to protect it from moisture. I've wetted out our limbers here with unthickened epoxy. On a couple of these frames where the bevel on here was steeper, I found it easier to screw my router jig directly to the frame. While these holes would be buried in the finished product, I always like to fill them up as best I can. And so what I've got here is something I just call trunnels. So I'm just going to trim these off now. I've got a couple of spots where my router blew out my plywood face, which I'm not too happy about. I filled them with thickened epoxy. We're going to fair those out. And in the finished product, we have to remember this is going to be a painted boat all over. And so all of this will be hidden. Okay, so I wetted out the plywood gussets on these frames. I hate plywood with exposed edges, so this is just unthickened epoxy. And I thought I might point out my, I call these my bench jacks. So they're little, these are just little sliding legs that come out from underneath my bench. My bench has got a void here, and it makes for some really handy spots to hang things like this when you need it, or when I come in and my workbench is full of junk and I need to put some materials down I've just purchased. I just slide a bunch of these jacks out and then I can lay planks on there. They've been very handy over the years for all kinds of things. And in a pinch, if you need some clamping calls, you can always pull those out and use them somewhere else. Alright, that's it for this episode. Now don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Ciao for now. Thanks for watching. I'll see you later.